friends. Let's bring it back. How are we doing today? Thumbs up. Thumbs into the side. I need to see more thumbs. You all have thumbs. How are you doing? How are you feeling? It's the end of the week. I don't know. Does anyone have any, who has a midterm this week? Oh, wow, really? Who has a midterm next week? Yes. Nice. Yeah, all right. So hopefully this is a calm before the storm. Almost a spring break. I'm looking forward to it as much as you guys are. I woke up at 1:30 today by accident. I had a class at 10. Oh well, that's what this week is for. Yeah, so today we're going to finally talk about the last big thing that you guys need to know to really, really understand how React works. Everything after this point is really going to be kind of throwing more examples at you guys, learning about it in a slightly different context. But this, so far we've talked about components with props, right? How components work, passing around props and all. Today we're going to talk about a really, really important concept called state. State is, if you've been looking at React docs or other things around with React to find help for your assignments, you've probably run into state before, but it's something that's really, really, without state, you really don't have what React really is. So we'll get into that today, and a lot of that will be again through the demo. So if you ever need to recap what happened today, we're recording lecture again, and so you'll be able to follow up. We'll post it right afterwards. But yeah, just kind of prefacing that this is a very, very key lecture. Feel free to come back to it if you feel like we're going too fast. But we're going to spend today just kind of going through examples of how state works and how you guys can use it. Other, I think, small notes. Let's see. Oops. Small notes. Project 1, Part 1, we released it a couple days ago. Right now the due date is next Tuesday. It's not too long. It's, again, once the things that you have been already doing with React and props and such. None of the stuff that is covered in today's lecture is in this part of the homework, or in this part of the project. So we strongly recommend you guys start as soon as you can, especially before midterm season hits. But yeah, and also, as always, sign up for office hours if you need help. Ask us questions on our discourse. But yeah, the project to do then, keep that in your calendar. Any questions on that deadline? The project, anything about the project? Cool. Let's see. Another small thing I'll add to this is if you have live questions for lecture, I'll link this on the portal. But go to bit.ly/rd lecture 6. So if you guys have questions throughout this lecture and you're not sure and you don't want to raise your hand or we already moved past it, ask on this discourse topic. So you can go to talk.react.decal and find this. You can click this link. I'll put it on the portal. But ask your questions. Some of our TAs are here with us today. We'll be answering them. But we also encourage you to ask them when Ethan prompts you. And I think that's it. Yeah, any other questions? Yep. Oh, yeah. We'll have a section during class to do attendance real quick. Yeah. Any other questions? Great. Let's get onwards. So let's talk about what we're kind of missing so far. Right? I mentioned that there's a big part of React we haven't really talked about. And we've kind of mentioned, we've kind of run into some issues with things we can't do with React. But let's look at one a little bit more closely. So this is something we did at the very beginning of React. Not sure if any of you guys remember it, but it was a greeter. Right? We wanted to have an input box, an input text box, where as the user types, we'd be able to say hello, whatever they type, right? And this is maybe a small way of how we do this, right? So right here, this is what we're rendering, right? We have a header with saying hello, and then using this name variable, which we declared up here. And then we have an input text box with an onChange listener. And our question is, how can we use onChange to update what name is? Right, this is kind of the big question here of okay, we have this listener, right? And we want to take the value from whatever the user types and display it on the screen, right? Any thoughts on how we do this based on what we've talked about already? Or, yeah. How can we accomplish this? Anyone can throw out any ideas that you might have seen in other classes or just other patterns? Yeah?
OnChange, you trigger a function which you would define between name and return. And you pass in the event. And then you read the event.target.value to name.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable to me, right? We could define a function inside, in between name and return, where onChange it'll read this event.target.value, right, and set that to name. Anyone see any problems with that, or what we're missing there, or why that might not work? I'm kind of leading you on to like the whole point of state, but can anyone see a problem with that method? It's defining a function and just changing name. Yeah?
Is name going to be a local variable within that function and not within the one you want to actually change?
Yeah, maybe, but what if we just put name at the very top of everything so anyone can access or change name? Not a good practice, but let's say we could do that. There's actually something bigger that we're missing from this kind of scope here, or like from doing it this way, by changing the way that we've been kind of doing it so far. That we've been kind of skirting around the issue of this because we didn't want to mention state. But when we change the name variable, right, who says that the React component is going to call render again, right? When we did React DOM.render and passed in our component to tell React which component to put on the page, right? We kind of promised you guys that it would call the render function, right, and display whatever the current value of, it would say hi, and then let's say like name was like, initialized to Avant, it would say hi Avant, right? But if you type in the input box and say, and change it to Ethan, right, it could change the name variable, but it wouldn't actually call render again, right? So far, render, we've only really seen render being called once, right? And that's the first time it gets put on the page. We put the parent component on the page, and it puts all its child components on the page, and that's it. Nothing really changes. In the homework, we had this kind of magical set tweets function that when you call it, we promised you would get like a new set of props with all the new tweets you need to display. But we kind of hid away like how are these things changing, right? We don't really have a function to recall the render function because React has been the one that's been calling the render function in the first place. You guys see what's like that like small issue, the fact that we can't recall the render function. Anyone have questions on that or what we've done so far relating to this re-rendering issue?
We cannot.
We cannot, or we have not learned yet a way to like ask React to re-render our component, right? So far, if we want to change the name, that's fine, right? We can change the name variable. However, render does not get called again, right? Because React only called render so far when we first put the component on the page, never again. So today, the topic of our lecture is really learning when does React re-render the component and how can we like control that? How can we hook into this re-rendering process? All right. So again, most of the rest of this lecture will be taken care of through a demo. But real quick, let's do attendance. So I'll put up the link again. I need to activate attendance real quick. Lecture 6. Great. You guys should be able to access attendance at this link now. I'll refresh the page if you weren't able to already. Great. Take attendance real quick, and then Ethan was going to set up for the demo that will take up most of our lecture. Once again, if you have questions, go to talk.react.DeCal and ask any questions you have about what we're learning. But yeah, fill this attendance form now. We don't want to leave it open for too much longer. So we'll all close it within 5-10 minutes. Bye.
Oh yeah, I can pull it.
Just keep your DMs with me.
Okay. Alrighty. So while you are filling out attendance, let me kind of give context to this next demo. So what we want to do here, this is an example of just a display of the clock, like a time for right now. And our goal here is to make React automatically update this time so that every second that passes, we get the exact time being rendered on the page. Okay? Sound good? And the way we're going to do this is we're going to have to pull in that concept that Avant just mentioned. We have to somehow tell React we need to re-render this component so that we can update it with the new value of the time. Okay? Does that make sense? So let's kind of go through what I have on this sandbox so far and just explain what's happening. So first, this should look a lot like the React component that you've already written. We have a class. It's called app. It extends React.component. Then we see this new function. We haven't actually seen these before. This is a constructor. This acts a lot like the constructors that you might have seen in 61B or just any place that you've used object-oriented programming, it turns out that this is not going to be something that a lot of the time, this constructor in the React context is used to do some initial setup for the component. So there won't be too many like object-oriented concepts being pulled in here. But the important thing that you want to remember is if you define a custom constructor, like we've done here for this app component, you have to call super props at the top. Okay? So super is kind of that call to the super class, which is React.component, because this app is subclassing the class React.component. So we call the React.component constructor with props. Okay? So you need to make sure this line is in here if you're calling constructor. Okay? Any questions about that before we continue? Okay, so we have a constructor. We're going to do something in here later, but let's just leave it there for now. It actually isn't doing anything beyond what we've already seen before. Okay? Next, we have a render function, right? This is where we specify what JSX should visually represent this component that we're trying to render, right? So we have a div here. It has a class name of app. It has an image with our React DeCal logo and an H1 that uses some class names that you will be maybe using in your project. These class names are coming from Semantic UI. So if you haven't looked into the project yet, you'll kind of see these similar class names soon, but all of these styles are being pulled in from a custom styling or an external styling library called Semantic. Okay? So that's why these fonts look different than the default. Okay? And right now we just have some text that's mostly static, right? It's just time. And then we're evaluating this expression, new date.toLocale timestring. Okay? And all this does is new date constructs a date without any parameters. What it does is it constructs a date for the time that it was evaluated at. So it's no longer 609, but it was 609 when I pulled up this demo. Okay? So if we run this again in our console, we won't get 609:33, we'll get the current time, right? So if I evaluate this, we'll get 6:25:23 p.m. Okay? So what we want to do, though, is you'll notice that this is not automatically updating, right? Just because I've specified a new date.toLocale timestring, it's kind of frozen in place because the render function has only been called once, right? So what we're going to need to do to tell React to update this multiple times is we're going to have to store this date as a part of the component's state, okay? So state is how we're going to specify a value in our component that when changed, will cause the render function to be called again. Okay? So let's take a look at how this works. First, after the super props call, which is, again, is our constructor, or the constructor from React.component, you'll see if I just added this new line, the screen flickered and updated with the new time. That's just because Code Sandbox is live updating. That's, yeah. But what we're going to do is we're going to first specify the first value for state, okay? So the first thing to notice about state is it is an object, okay? And this should look familiar. An object is a set of key value pairs. And we can specify some values that our React component will react to when they are changed, okay? So this is actually, again, like a big reason why React is even called React in the first place is because you'll see the component will change when we update the state values, okay? So let's go ahead and get on with it. We're going to call this field current time, and we're going to construct a new date in there, right? So again, this constructor will only be called once when the component is initially rendered. And this initial state value will be set to a new date at the time the component was created. Okay? But now that I have this set up in this.state, I can actually access that inside of render, right? So what do you think I can replace new date.toLocale timestring with in order to use the state date? How do I use the date from state? Yeah? This.state.current time, yep. So if I do this.state.current time, that will replace new date, right? So now that I have a date inside of current time, I can call this.state.current time.toLocale timestring, and now it is going to go ahead and use that value. So nothing has actually changed yet. And who can tell me why? Who can tell me why it's still kind of fixed? What's going on here? Yeah. Oh, So you're saying because I included these parentheses, it's not updating. That's not quite it. It turns out if I do this, nothing will render because this toLocale timestring is just a function, and a function isn't a valid React child. We can only render JSX or text or like a string. So that's not quite it. The reason why this isn't updating is because this is a lot like new date, right? We're only updating this.state.current_time once when the component is initially rendered, right? So if we want to make any changes to this value, we're going to actually have to update that value somewhere else in the component, okay? All right. So in order to do that, let's first test this out by using a built-in function that we should have seen before, which is setTimeout. Okay? So who remembers what setTimeout does? Anyone remember? Yeah.
Does it tell Java to JavaScript pause for a bit?
Yeah. It tells JavaScript to delay some operation, right? So setTimeout takes a function, and we pass it. So we're passing it this function right now, and we're going to define some behavior here to actually go ahead and update state. Okay? So this is the function. I haven't put anything in there yet, but I'm going to set this delay to 3 seconds. So 3 seconds later, something in this function will be run. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to update state with the this.setState call. Okay? And I'll kind of explain what's going on here in a bit. But for now, let's set current time to another new date, right? Because like I said, new date will create a date at the current time it was constructed, right? So let's try that. So I'm going to refresh this. I don't know if that already showed up. But 3 seconds later, we should see it actually update from 6 to 9 seconds, right? Did you see that? So 3 seconds later, some state variable changed, and that state variable was current time. And what happened is React decided, OK, it's time to call render again. It's time to update the page, right? It's time to update this value, which is no longer the date that I was originally given. It has changed, so now I need to go ahead and re-render the component, OK? Does that kind of make sense? So any questions about that before we continue? Yeah.
So is setState automatically re-rendering the component? Because there's no new call to render or anything. It just does setState. So does setState automatically re-render what? Does it re-render that component specifically or the entire page?
Good question. Yeah, so setState does automatically re-render the component when values change. What it's going to do is React is going to be as efficient as possible with updating your page. So it's not actually going to re-render the whole page unless it absolutely needs to, right? So I might show you a demo of what React is actually updating in a bit. But what it's going to do is it's going to go into your JSX, determine the values that need to be changed, and smartly update only that part of your HTML tree, okay? So does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. So setState does, we don't need to call, we never call render ourselves, except when we call React DOM.render, in which case, that's what kind of kicks off your application, right? But yeah, sorry, there was another part of your question. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
State is predefined by React.component and empty at the beginning, so we don't create the state, but we override it.
We don't create the state, but we override it. Yeah, so there is no, that's a good question. So yeah, the reason why we can call this.state equals some object at the beginning is because we need to set it equal to some original value. One thing that you do not want to do to update state is call this.state.current_time equals new date, okay? So this is not something that you can do after you have initially passed this into the constructor, right? So whenever you're trying to update state, you want to use the built-in function setState in order to do that. And the reason why is because React is going to perform some efficient comparisons. It's like a shallow comparison across the fields of your state object. So it can, again, smartly determine which parts of your tree need to be updated, which parts of your page need to be updated. That's a part of the reason why React is going to be good at updating your page efficiently, is because of that specific setState call. Yeah. Okay. So clearly we don't want this clock to just update 3 seconds and then not do anything ever again. So we're going to actually adjust this, and we're gonna let me bring this back to this.setState, and we're gonna make this current time is new date. Okay, make this current time new date, and instead of set timeout, I'm going to use set interval. Okay, I'm going to call set interval, which calls something repeatedly, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat this set state update every second. Okay, so every second I'm going to update the current time with a new date. And now what's happening is React is updating this value every second, right? So this.state.current time is changing every second, and React is going to update that component accordingly. Sound good? So now we have a functional clock, right? So now we actually have this clock working now that we've called this.setState every second. All right? Any questions on this? Yeah.
When you in this dot set state, how are you like? Why are you passing this entire current time for the new date? Because couldn't you just simply say this state dot current time and it would just access that and update it?
Yeah, so you're asking why can't I just say this.state.current time equals new date?
No, not that. Like, why can't you just pass in this dot state dot current time?
Right here?
No, over there in the this dot set state function.
Yeah, so the setState function, like the first argument to it is an object, and the object represents the changes you want to make to state. Okay, so are you asking why are we doing new date as opposed to this.state.current time?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, if we use this.state.current time, that would just be the old value, right? So in that case, React would say, well, this value hasn't changed, so I'm not going to update the page. Right? So we're constructing a new date every time because new date is what creates a new date object at the current time it was constructed, right? So just to make this clear, like when I call new date, every time I do this, it's like, do you see how this time is changing? When I call new date, it's the date object at the time it was constructed. Okay? So see that? It's changing. It's changing every time I call new date. Okay? Alrighty. So we have a quick check-in for you. So let me pull up our check-in. So if you could go to, I'm gonna bring up a link here. Let's see. All right, so let's go to yellkey.com/matter. Oh, it shrinks. How does it do that? That's weird. yellkey.com/matter. Okay. And we have a quick check-in for you before we continue. And this is just a check-in about just to make sure that you have a good grasp of what state is essentially so far. Okay. So there's like the first question is a little bit tricky. So try to answer it yourself, and then we'll regroup to answer it within your lab groups. Okay. So try to answer this yourself first, and then we'll regroup in a bit. Do I duplicate forms?
sure it's like we'll update you guys. It's either I'm pretty sure it'll be Wednesday, but yeah, we can assume Wednesday and we'll clarify.
Okay. All right, so now that most folks seem to have answered, talk about your answers a little bit in your lab group, and like work with the people around you to discuss what you put, okay? And we'll give you maybe 2-3 minutes to do that, kind of come to consensus, and we'll fill out the form again, okay? All right, go. Okay, everyone, let's bring it back. Alrighty, let's talk about some of these questions. I'm not actually going to have you fill it out again for the sake of time, but let's talk about some of these questions. What did people think about needing state for some of these options? Let's start with the first one, storing user input from a text box. So just like, just keeping track in general of user input. Do we need state? Do we not need state? What were our thoughts on that? You need state? Why do we need state?
That's how, like, even in the time thing, although the user was not passing in any input,
Uh-huh.
he was still calling a built-in function to store some value. So, I mean, if it's a form, you can still use this.state to store the user.
That's true, but what if I just created a variable here? What if I just said like, let name, right? And in some onChange property, what if I just said name equals something?
But then would you be able to use set state to update that?
No, I wouldn't. I would just say name equals something. So name equals event.target.value, right? So this was this was kind of a trick, but there is a difference between just wanting to store it, right? Just wanting to keep track of it in some form, versus storing it and using it to update your component, right? So storing a user input from a text box, you can still use variables, right? You could still use variables like in normal JavaScript. This .state doesn't mean you place everything you need to keep track of inside of state. That's not really the purpose of state. State is only when you need to keep track of values that will update your component in some form. Okay? So what we call that is we call that a value that participates in the data flow of the component, which means that when some data changes, React needs to re-render the component in a smart way. React needs to react to those values updating. That's kind of the idea. So if we just want to store the user input, usually we're going to use state because we need it to update the view in some way. But if we're just storing the user input, technically we don't need state, right? So again, this was kind of a trick, but if we need it to participate in the data flow of a component in some way, we're going to need to use state. Okay, so that was that. Keeping track of time on a stopwatch. This is a lot like what we just did with setInterval, right? So if we need to keep track of some date object that is local to a component and using it to update that stopwatch, then we do need state, right? Because in that case, our date is participating in the data flow of that component, right? Because when the date value changes, we want to also update the component view, right? Displaying multiple components. We've actually done this before, right? We don't technically need state to render a bunch of components on screen, right? So you remember in our Twitter lab /homework3, which was due yesterday, we still displayed multiple components, right? We didn't need state for that technically. So that you don't need state for. Showing how many times a user has clicked on your component. Again, this has to do with using it to update your view, right? So because you're keeping track of a value, and that value has to do with the number of times the user has clicked, you're going to want to use state to update that. Yeah?
So I was kind of confused on this specific one we're talking about right now because we did a cookie clicker, project, and then we did click, and then it showed us how many times we clicked if we just need scoring for cluster equals 1.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. So Evan brings up that we did build cookie clicker, right? We built that, and we didn't need set state at all there, right? Well, that was when we weren't using React at all, right? That was when we were just using vanilla JavaScript, and we were able to manually update the object, the DOM node that represented that element, right? But we're no longer responsible for doing that. In this case, React is actually handling the creation of those DOM nodes for you, and it's doing so in the most efficient way possible, right? So in this case, we're not actually updating the DOM nodes, we're just modifying some value, and React will do that diffing in order to get you to the next state you need to be in for your component, okay? So yeah, that's a good point, but we weren't using React at that point, yeah. Alrighty, how do we update a name, property, and state? Yeah.
I just had a question.
Oh yeah.
So in general, what's the key way of knowing when you need to use state and when you don't? What are the traditional constraints?
Yeah, great point. So the question is, when do we need to use state? How do we know when we need to use state? So general guidance here is if you need your component to keep track of some value and you're using that value to update something dynamically on within your component to show that value on the screen or use it in some way, you're going to want to use state. In other words, if your view needs to react to changes to that value, that's when you use state, okay? So you can think of it as a place to just store things locally to a component, but more strictly, if your component needs to react to changes to a value, then you use state. State values are what causes a component to re-render. Either state value changes or prop value changes. Okay, so Avant will kind of dive more into the big picture of prop, state, component, what's going on here. But yeah, the two things you need to know: prop changes cause components to re-render, and state changes cause a component to re-render. Okay, yeah.
So in terms of the tweet row project,
Yes.
When it relists different tweets based on your searching,
Yeah.
it's updating different components in the page. Is that a case in which prompts are being updated as well?
Exactly. Yeah. So the question was in our tweet row lab. Why were those components all able to update? That's because our tweets array was changing, right? So the props.tweets was changing, and so because that was changing, our list of tweet rows was re-rendering, right? Because that array had changed. Yeah.
Do you need to call some magic function like set state when you want to access the props, or can you directly change props by simply props dot equals?
Yeah, good question. So is there some magic this.setProps function? Well, the answer to that is you don't want to update props inside of a component, right? Because props are read-only by a component, right? So if you want to modify the prop values that are being passed into your component, you're going to have to go to the component that renders that component, right? Props are received from parents, from parent components. So the component that is receiving those props can't change those values. Only the parent can change those values.
But the parent itself, when it changes the values of its child,
Mm-hmm.
is it then re-rendered automatically? No.
Yes. So oftentimes what happens is like the parent component will manage some values in state, and sometimes it'll pass those values into props of children, right? So then when that parent's state values are updated, the prop values will also be updated, which causes that data flow down, right? That causes those changes to propagate down components as long as you're passing those state values from the top component down into child, child, child.
I'm a bit confused because
Sure.
when we call components, that's mostly in a simple case it's within the return, or the return. If you would write everything in line, it would be everything only in the return. If you could squash it down to everything being only in return, what we've done so far. So this is, in my point of view, instant. Create an object and render it, but we don't keep track of that reference. So we have not learned to store this component in a local variable to then later.
You're right. We haven't talked about passing state values down into props yet. That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about how we update name property and state. What was the answer to this one? What do people think? Ideas? The first one, yes, it was this.setState, and then we pass in an object, name, my name, okay? So none of these other ones are actually going to update your state value, right? So this one said this.state. This.state is not a function. This one sent in the wrong parameters. This one is just this.name. That doesn't have to do with state at all. And we cannot modify state in this way if we want React to update the component, okay? Cool. So let's move on to our next demo, which is a greeter component. So this is this kind of reflects our slides about how do we build a greeter in React, and hopefully this should also look familiar. This will be kind of a similar example to what all the event listeners that we've been seeing over the past 2 weeks. So what we'll do here is first we will update, we will set an initial state, kind of like we've been doing for the timer or for the clock. And let's call this name, right? And the first value for name will just be an empty string, okay? So we're going to just set it to an empty string at first, and we're going to use that in the h1 like this. So we're going to call hello, this.state.name. And because this.state.name is an empty string, it just says hello, comma, all right? It just says hello, comma. And inside of our input, what we're going to do is we're going to add an onChange property, a lot like what you did inside of your tweet row homework. And what we're going to do is we are going to add a function inside of onChange that takes in an event, right? So an event object. The purpose of taking the event object is to figure out what the value of this text box currently is. And what we're going to do is we're going to call this .setState here with name and then event.target.value. Okay, so here's a better formatted version of that, right? So this is going to all go away when I save. But this is a function, right? It takes in the event object, kind of like you've used for onChange before. And it calls this .setState, and it updates the name property with whatever the value of the text box is at this moment. So what do I expect to happen now? What should happen whenever I type into this text box? All right, so if I key E into this text box, what happens? Yeah. Yeah, it's going to say hello E, right? So this is just going to update with any value that I type in this text box, and even with backspaces, right? It's changing, so it's causing state updates, right? That's an example of a greeter, right? Yeah.
So the set tweet function that you've given us for tweet row, was that essentially just a set state?
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
The set tweet function that you've given us for tweet row homework,
Yeah.
was it just like like a call to set state?
No, so set tweets was a little bit more complicated. There was some logic there that we kind of abstracted away for you. There was a set state call somewhere in the higher order component, but you didn't have to worry about it. But there was more logic contained behind that. Okay? All right, how are we feeling on state so far? You've kind of seen two examples of updating state, one for time and one for user input. Give me thumbs up, thumbs down. How are we feeling? Okay, any questions? Yvonne's going to do a quick conceptual wrap up of what we've seen so far, and then, yeah, that'll be, yeah, question?
So I was wondering if for some reason something gave out two events, how do you know which event to receive on TV? Let's say, I have no idea. Let's say clicking gave you an X and a Y position. How would you know that EV represents X or Y?
EV has both. So EV is an entire object, and it has a bunch of properties inside of it.
All right, great. So that was, this is a very big high overview of state. We've seen two examples of exactly how it's used, and I know there's probably a lot of questions running in your mind of when do you use it, how would I use it? It's kind of hard to think about, like you've seen how it's used here, but going from like a task of like, hey, use it in this way might be still a little confusing. Don't be too worried. We're gonna like our lab for next week, which is try to attend despite the midterms. Let us know if you can't, and if you can't, make sure to look at it because it's very important. It'll give you kind of a slow walkthrough of adding state to a couple different problems. So you guys will see this idea of like passing state or props, using state to pass new props into children, and so on. But let's just look at some kind of big picture things about this. Is that this is, so it's kind of cut off, but let's review how this greeter works a little bit more in depth. When the user changes the input text box in any way, we call this.setState, right? The reason we want to call this.setState is because in the most abstract sense, forgetting a little bit of ignoring a little bit of the specifics, setState is going to re-render this component. Unless state actually didn't change at all, or there's no reason to re-render, this.setState will cause your component to re-render. So anytime you want to display or change how your component looks, right, and it's not coming in from the parent in any way, anytime that your component wants to change how it looks or any of its children looks, you have to call this.setState and update update some value, right? Any changes on how the component looks must come through state. So in this case, this onChange is going to call this.setState and update the value of the current text. And then when we want to, another important thing is what gets passed into this.setState isn't the entire state object. It's not so far we've only been looking at this with one property inside state. The first time it was current time. This with greeter it was name or current text in this case. But you only want to whatever object you pass into this.setState gets combined with the initial state. So if you have 100 properties in state and you only want to update one of them, you only have to pass in a new object with the one you want to update. So that's a small kind of discrepancy. But once you so when you want to render when you're rendering your component, you'll want to base what's on the screen depending on some values that are currently inside your state. So we have this.state.currentText as what's in our heading, and then we'll worry about this later because we didn't really get to talk about that. But these two are the most important parts here, right? Is that when we're displaying our component, we want to say hello, whatever is currently inside state. Whenever the user enters new text, we want to update state, and we want to re-render the component. So key thing is setState does two things. It changes the state object, it changes the values, as well as re-render the component. Finally, in order to make state work, we also need to have this constructor that we just introduced. This constructor will get called every time the component gets instantiated. So every time you put that component on the screen, it'll all have its own constructor call. The first line should always be superprops. Just the hard and fast rule. Nothing, you don't really need to worry about what it's doing. Just have that as be your first line always. And then after that, we want to create our initial values for state. So in fact, if we go back here, and just to see what this means, is that if I change this to Avant, that means now, instead of starting off blank, it'll start with Avant, right? This is just that first render call. It needs to have some values to look at, which is why we have this. Great. Yeah, and so state really helps us manage the internal updating of a component. When a component wants to update itself, not really caring about its parents at all, we want to use state. Any questions? Any questions about, again, this? Feel free to use that talk.react.decal post the topic we made for lecture questions. Even after lecture ends, we'll answer them all. But this bigger picture, this is the last thing we want to talk about, is what's the difference between props and state? This image is a little bit, great, yeah. Props versus state. Props always come in from the parent. You will never, like a component never changes its props. You should never be writing the text this dot props equals. Props always get passed in from the parent component. So in this case, some component will render this guy, and they'll send props to this component. And then state helps this component re-render itself. So when you get new props from a parent, React will like re-render this component based on the new props. But if you want to re-render it like within the component, you need to use state. Again, we'll like kind of explore this difference a little bit, like make this very, very clear in the lab. But ultimately, this is a really important relation to understand, is that props get passed between component from parent to child in components, and then state is kind of like state belongs. Every component has its own state. Yes. All right. Great. Any questions? Okay. Feel free to come up to us afterwards. Make sure to come to lab next week. Start the project. Yeah. Have a great weekend.
I always underestimate how long those forms take.